So we're going to continue now with the last part of sociological theory that I want to discuss. And this is feminism, which is much more than simply saying women are unequal in society and that's not fair. Even though often for people who are not really familiar with feminist theory, that seems to be the perception they have. That's what they boil it down to. The textbook makes the point that we don't have a long history of female feminist theorists going back a few hundred years, writing about sociology, writing at the same time as Emile Durkheim or Karl Marx or Max Weber, because society at these times did not provide the opportunity for women to be educated as men. Women couldn't work outside the home in the same manner as men. And even the ideas of women were simply not taken as seriously or acknowledged. Historically speaking, the opportunities available for women in life were much more restricted. For those women that did become active academically in some way, in regards to theory, they tended not to fit the usual mold of women in their time. And this is an example. Harriet Martineau, who was a social theorist born in England in 1802. She is considered one of the earliest female Western sociologists. She's also one of the very first female journalists. She worked as a speechwriter. She worked as a translator. And she wrote several books focused on what she perceived to be important social issues at that time. Now, when she wrote these books, she didn't write them in an academic manner. She wrote them in a manner that was very approachable for readers, because she'd write them more like a story. And because of this, readers had a much easier time understanding what she was saying and relating to it. Miss Martineau never married, which was extremely unusual for the Victorian era. And she even supported herself financially with her writing, which was also very unusual. In regards to sociology specifically, what she did was her main contribution was her insistence that when you're studying sociology, when you're studying society, it's important to focus on all aspects of it, not just one. So Miss Martineau really emphasized the importance of taking into consideration political issues, religious issues, and how social institutions in society affected people and vice versa. She said, and this is a direct quote, "When one studies a society, one must focus on all its aspects, including key political, religious, and social institutions," end quote. She was extremely, fiercely critical of all the inequality and injustice she saw in her world faced by girls and women, faced by slaves, and the working poor. And she said that if you take into account all aspects of society when studying it, then you can deduce why this inequality exists. Especially in regards to the inequality of girls and women, Miss Martineau believed that in order to understand their positions in society, in order to understand women's status in society as being lower to that of men, it would be necessary to thoroughly analyze society as a whole. Now, something I find interesting about her, considering her later views about the status of women in society, is that in her family growing up, her parents rigidly enforced strict gender roles. So she had brothers who were formally educated and they went to college, but she and her sisters were not allowed to, and instead they were simply taught domestic work. So this was a real formative life experience for her. And she, in response, bucked all traditional gender expectations and instead wrote extensively about gender inequality. So Miss Martineau was self-taught. Everything you read about her talks about what a voracious reader she was from a very young age. And surprisingly, when her father's business later failed, she even helped to support the family financially. So talk about a turnaround, a far stretch from the way she was raised. She is widely regarded as one of the first feminists in our world. And I can't help but think when I read about her that she would have been an interesting woman to meet and have a conversation with. Very intelligent, very gutsy to have the views she did for when she lived, and very gutsy to live the way she did, unmarried and earning her own living. So it wasn't until the 1960s that sociology as a discipline really began to feel an impact of feminist writers, and this was largely due to the women's movement at that time. In the 1960s, as you're probably aware, there was a surge of feminism, a surge of women who strongly supported total equality for women in various ways. They didn't just feel this way, they were active in trying to effect positive change in society. And it's important to realize that this isn't just that these ideas of inequality were spreading and gaining support theoretically speaking, but more and more women from all walks of life were organized and actively protesting and actively lobbying the government, joining women's organizations with the purpose of bringing about substantial and effective change in society regarding the rights of women overall. They were trying to make a whole series of reforms occur in society regarding equal pay for the same work, reproductive rights regarding the right to safe abortion procedures. They wanted legal change to be enacted against sexual harassment and sexual assault and sexual violence. They wanted legal changes to be made regarding domestic violence. They wanted more consideration given to maternity benefits for working women in terms of more time for maternity leave and better economic benefits during leave. So from a certain perspective, many people observed the women's movement of the 1960s as a revolution of sorts because everything kind of occurred in that one decade. Everything that had been building up came to a head in that one decade. To give you just a quick snapshot of what feminists did in the 60s and what occurred. Early in the decade, in 1963, a very, very famous book was published called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And the main idea of her book was that women were unhappy being in a position unequal to men. That instead of being these happy little housewives, completely fulfilled with their husband and their kids in their house, wanting nothing more out of life, she said that most housewives were actually not happy. They weren't fulfilled, they weren't satisfied. Ms. Friedan said that women were not content to be subservient to men financially, physically, intellectually. She said that many women were not content to only be a homemaker. Instead, in reality, her book, The Feminine Mystique, said that women who were homemakers were depressed, unfulfilled, not content with their life, and they wanted something for themselves beyond being a wife and mother. She referred to this unhappiness as the problem without a name. And she labeled the idealized image to which women were supposed to conform as the happy homemaker, as the feminine mystique. Even though this is one book, one perspective, it became immensely, overwhelmingly popular because it really embodied overall what thousands, if not millions of women had wanted to say for decades, that they wanted something for themselves outside of the home. So this one little book, you can still order it on Amazon, to this day is an international bestseller, viewed by many as the impetus for the women's movement in the 60s. So picture like a forest that's really dry, and this was the match that started the forest fire. Even though women had had these thoughts and feelings and ideas for decades and decades and decades, this book was the kick that really kind of got things going. Along with the feminine mystique, there were public and very well publicized protests and rallies and sit-ins to demonstrate support for women's issues. It was in the 1960s that various women's groups were formed, such as the National Organization of Women, and they set up task forces to work on education and employment and other women's issues, and now became one of the most well-known feminist groups and is still in existence. In the 1960s, there were lawsuits as feminist groups went to court to fight for equality, to stand up against discrimination, to work on the legal aspects of women's rights. In the 1960s, feminist leaders, medical professionals, women and men, spoke out against restrictions on abortion, so that in Canada, abortion became legal in 1969. And historically, women had fewer employment opportunities than men, fewer opportunities for advancement at work once they were employed. And they were often paid a lower salary for the same work, but in the 1960s, more professional jobs began to open up for women, at least a bit. So all of this was going on in one decade. All of this social and legal and political and personal change for women. And as a result, feminist theory began to impact sociology, evolving to become regarded as the fourth main sociological theory. So, feminism has certain key principles, and the first one of these is patriarchy. I don't think everybody who uses the word really understands what it means. Patriarchy is a system of male domination of women, and feminists strongly argue that inequality created by patriarchy, by an actual system in which women are dominated by men, is just as important in determining a person's opportunities in life as social and economic class. And I want you to really pay attention to the word system here. The idea of patriarchy is not just a belief. It refers to a social system in which males dominate women. Politically, socially. A social system in which males would dominate women legally and economically. And historically speaking, this is in fact the way the world was organized, including North America. The father of the family would have authority over their wife and children. And in fact, the word patriarchy literally means the rule of the father. Of course, this has changed over the centuries and over the decades, but these ideas and this system is not as old as you might think. And I'll give you a personal example here. I was born in 1971, and at that time, with me being her first child, my mom and dad decided they didn't want a fifth, they didn't want to have any more kids. So before she left the hospital when she had me, and at that time, when a woman had a child, she'd stay in the hospital for at least a week, she decided to have her tubes tied to prevent any further pregnancies. But the hospital wouldn't do it unless they had my father's signature indicating he was aware of it and he was okay with it. So I want you to think about that. In 1971, she couldn't have a medical procedure performed without her husband's consent. That wasn't that long ago. Now, the second main principle of feminism in regards to sociology is power and social convention, meaning that this domination is created by the powers of structure and convention. So it's not the actual physical, biological differences between males and females that create inequality for women. Instead, it's the social structures of society, like the legal structure and political structure and economic structure and everything you see here, that provide men more rights than women and a higher status than women. So think back to what I spoke about that women lobbied for during the 60s. Equal work for equal pay. That would involve social institutions that were both economic and legal. Sexual harassment would be affected by legal and religious and cultural and family and educational social institutions. So when feminist theory talks about power and social convention, what it means is that social structures in society that support and maintain and generate male dominance. This refers to systemic control. This is a good example here. This is a picture from March 2018. And in this picture, President Trump and representatives of the United States are on the right. And then representatives of Saudi Arabia are on the left. And this picture gained a lot of public attention because there is not a single female on the side of the United States representing that country. The only females in the room are journalists, are reporters. But here we are on the right side of the picture. They're supposed to be representing the entire country, and there's not a single woman included. Now, the third main principle of feminist theory is that it takes both a macro and a micro approach. And I think this makes sense because of what feminism is. It looks at personal, individual experiences and obstacles faced by girls and women. And it also looks at societal-wide experiences and obstacles. It looks at all of this from a micro perspective and a macro perspective. And the last main principle of feminist theory in regards to sociology is gender inequality. Now, gender is a person's feeling of being male or female. So take note that it does not refer to biology, it refers to your social identity. And gender inequality refers to the idea that men and women are not perceived as being equal in society. Feminist theory's focus on gender inequality can be applied to many examples around the world. In many countries, girls and women are not provided the same educational opportunities as men, so that it's estimated that of all the illiterate adults in the world, 2/3 of them are female. In some countries, the courts automatically grant custodial rights to the father, and women are left without children and without anything from the marriage. So a woman has a right to file for divorce in some countries, but she will lose everything. She'll walk away with nothing, including her children. In some countries, sexual assault laws do not apply to married couples, leaving women exposed to sexual subjugation. In some countries, there are no laws, or the laws are not enforced regarding age at marriage. So you could have an 11 or a 12-year-old girl married to somebody who's in their 50s or 60s. In some countries, men are typically just viewed as superior, which means if they want, they can divorce their wives very easily, but women cannot do the same. In Lebanon, if a woman is abused by her husband, she doesn't have the right to file for divorce unless there's actually an eyewitness who is willing to testify that they saw physical abuse take place. Even in North America, feminists would point out that female political participation is well below that of males. That picture was a good example of it that I had a few minutes ago. Even in North America, there continues to be occupational segregation by gender, sexual discrimination in employment, a pay gap regarding difference in what men and women make for the same work. Women continue to be much more susceptible to violence in a domestic relationship in North America. So gender inequality is the last main principle of feminist theory in regards to sociology. Let's pull all of this together. In this week, what we've done is look at what sociology is as a discipline, and then the 4 main sociology theories. So I talked about what sociology is, and this idea of a sociological imagination, that you're never an isolated being, you are always influenced by society, and there is and always will be a connection between your own experiences and wider society. I spoke about Emile Durkheim and his idea of social solidarity, just how connected a person is to the society they live in, or their lack of connectedness. The first main theory was functionalism, which focuses on how human behavior is governed by social structures that are based mainly on shared values that contribute to social stability. We talked about conflict theory, focusing on the development of social class struggle as a result of industrialization, and all that is mostly attributed to Karl Marx. Weber agreed with Marx, but said there would be a wider variety of social classes. Antonio Gramsci brought in his idea of cultural hegemony, widening the possible sources of inequality to include a society's culture. Michel Foucault looked at the relationship between power and knowledge, and how the major social institutions in society use this to their advantage. This idea of post-structuralism also looked at the relationship of language and power, how each of us create our reality by the language we use. Third main sociological theory was symbolic interactionism. That looks at how each of us develop meanings for the things in our world, and George Herbert Mead spoke about how we all develop a sense of self through social interaction, trying to take on the perspective of other people. And the last sociological theory we looked at was feminism, a theory that had a late start, so to speak, compared to the others, simply because of the position of women in society, historically speaking, but the 1960s really helped to change that. And in regards to this, I spoke about Harriet Martineau and how you should focus on studying all of society. So, I want you to remember that even if I didn't talk about something from the chapter specifically here, you're still responsible for it on the quiz for this week, as well as on the final exam at the end of the course. And I hope you feel like you've developed just a little bit of an understanding of what basic sociological theory is all about.